Welcome back to Way of the Wrench, and on today's very special episode, I'm going to be showing you everything you need to know to be able to check your steering system components for any kind of play or wear issues. So stick around, you're not going to want to miss it. All right, so first off, how are you even going to know if you have a steering issue? Well, one of the first dead giveaways on a part that's really badly worn is that you're going to feel and possibly hear a clunking sensation every time you change the direction with the steering wheel. And depending on how bad it is, sometimes you can faintly feel it or hear it, and when it gets really, really bad, you'll actually hear clunk, 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 and then you got to find where that's coming from. Now, what that generally is we have a lot of components that have kind of a ball and a socket shape to them. And when they're good, that joint allows the parts to go up and down when you go over speed bumps and potholes. And when you turn the car, it allows it to turn this way. But when one component wants to move in or out, the other one has no choice but to move in and out. Now, when they're good, they're like that. But once they start to have some play, the socket's kind of opened up a bit and there's some free play in there. And so that clunking sound is the sound of this looseness in that joint that's going back and forth. Now, it also could be from a steering rack bushing, which we'll talk about in a sec. And some other symptoms you might come across is that when you are driving straight down the road, you find that if you turn the steering wheel slightly left and right, there's a little bit wider of a dead zone where it doesn't actually do anything. Or you might find that through your turning and driving the vehicle that you're kind of constantly just overcorrecting a little bit and the steering just feels a little bit sloppy. The other thing you might find is that if you're driving straight and you hit a bump, that all of a sudden the car wants to kind of turn a little bit. And you also might find, if your steering components are really bad, where your steering wheel actually shakes a little bit while you're driving. So all of these can be symptoms of having some worn steering components. Now, waiting for your steering components to have that much play where you can feel the looseness and hear clunks is really not the safe way to do it. In fact, it's quite dangerous, because if your joints have enough play in them that they're making noise and having that much movement, they're ready to give out. And when that steering component gives out, you're going to have one of the wheels go hard left or hard right, and this is going to be at speed. So you're going to be going into the ditch or directly into oncoming traffic, and that is outright dangerous. So there's a much better way of diagnosing your steering components, and that is through doing a 6-month, at least maybe every year, a full inspection of the vehicle and doing a wheel shake test. So let me show you that. Now, in order to do this wheel shake test, you do have to have the vehicle off the ground. Otherwise, it's going to mask any kind of play because of the weight of the vehicle is on that joint. So lift the vehicle up off the ground, and if you're not sure how to do that, I'll post a link on my How to Jack Up a Vehicle, and that way you can check that out and do that at home. Now, for today, we've got it already lifted up on the hoist, so that way it's easier for me to film for you guys. Now, when you go to do this shake test, what you're doing is grabbing the left and right side of the wheel and going in and out. There's no spinning involved, just in and out quite quickly. And you're sensing for any kind of loose play or any kind of loud clunks coming from underneath on the other side. And when you're doing the left and right, you're also going to do up and down, because it's kind of a test for multiple things. So the first thing is, if we have play this way, as well as up and down, that's going to be one of three things. It's going to be either a bad wheel bearing, and if you're not sure how to fully diagnose a bad wheel bearing, I'll post another link to a good video on how to diagnose wheel bearings. The other thing it could be, and it's my first go-to to check, is, are these lug nuts loose? If those are loose, that wheel's going to be loose as well. And then the third thing is kind of a multi-problem. You could have steering components that are worn, as well as suspension components that are worn for those situations. Now, when you go to do this shake, if the up and down is no shaking, no looseness, then that means your suspension system is okay. And if you go left and right and there is play, then that is going to be only steering components. And so once you know that it's only shaking left and right and you know it's steering components, what you need to do is get a friend to simulate that shaking while you go underneath with the light and try to look at the spots. I'm going to show you in a second to figure out which component has failed. Now, the other thing you can do too is you can have somebody in the car and going like left and right with the steering wheel back and forth, and that will also move the steering component so you can find where there's some play. And if it is clunking, then you can kind of follow the clunking to try to find where that bad component is too. So let me show you the spots you need to check. So the first component we want to look at, and the most commonly worn out part, is the outer tie rod. Now, this is a rod that ties or connects our steering knuckle to our power steering rack. And it has a rubber boot here that inside there is a ball and socket kind of joint like I just talked about. And the wear is going to be underneath this boot. So the way you check this is as somebody is shaking the wheel back and forth, left and right, you're going to put your finger right inside the boot and kind of get the edge of your finger or your thumb touching the edge of the metal on the tie rod here and the steering knuckle itself. And if this joint is good, as you shake it back and forth, this and this part will start to move together. If the part is bad, what you're going to feel is that one of these components kind of moves a split second earlier than the other, and then the other one catches up to move with it. And that's generally a sign that there is some play in that joint and this needs to be replaced. Now, another kind of indicator is if you look at this rubber boot, it should look nice and rubber and pliable, should be dry, shouldn't be any grease kind of coming out. If there's cracks or it's got age cracks, any kind of tears and grease is coming out, that's another sign that this outer tie rod needs to be changed or it has very little life left on it if it still doesn't have play. Now another thing you can do is you can get yourself a nice big pry bar, and on the metal part of the outer tie rod and a metal part of the steering knuckle, you can put this in between and try to pull the two apart, try to lever them apart. And if there's no play, you won't sense any movement. If there's some play, you're going to see that the outer tie rod kind of disconnects and moves a little bit. Here's an outer tie rod from another vehicle, and you can see that this is able to go up and down over bumps and to go left and right to steer, but it should not be having any play inwards or outwards. And this one does have a lot of play. Check this out. Look at how much play that is. That is horrible. This thing is ready to fail and have a wheel go hard left or hard right and not having the ability to be able to straighten it up. So pretty dangerous. Now, while I'm talking about it, if you have one of these outer tie rods that has a grease nipple, when you're doing your inspection, once every 6 months or so, you can hook up a grease gun and put your finger on the rubber boot, and as you go, squeeze the handle once or twice, you should be able to feel that kind of grease go into here and puff this up a little bit. Do not go more than 2 shots of grease, because what happens is you will continue to pump this up until it blows, and once you blow that out and grease is coming out, that is an ability for salt water to get in, and those joints don't last too much longer after you do that. Now when you follow the outer tie rod towards the motor, you're going to notice that this transitions into another part here. This is the start of our inner tie rod. Now the inner tie rod threads into the end of the outer tie rod, and there's a jam nut here to tighten it and to hold the two securely where we want it. Now on the other end is once again another one of those ball and socket kind of joints, and once again it's underneath this rubber bellows, so it's kind of hard to see. And these rubber bellows are kind of like a harder rubber, and it's kind of an accordion style, so these can be actually pretty tricky to diagnose. However, once you've checked your outer ones and there is no play, then you know it's highly likely it's under this, and it's the inner tie rod joint that is bad. Now, how you have to check this is you have to get your fingers in there and you have to kind of squish the rubber so that you can actually touch the inner shaft of the inner tie rod where it starts to go into a bigger piece where the actual ball and socket is. And once you feel that end and you kind of have it right against the two parts where the socket is, you once again get your friend to shake the wheel left and right, and you will be able to feel that looseness and the disconnect between the two parts in underneath that rubber bellows. And once again, you should be checking this rubber boot for any kind of signs of leaks or grease coming out, or if there's any kind of tear or age cracking. If there is, then this boot should be replaced. And once again, it's probably a sign that salt water and grit have gotten in and has damaged that joint, and that's why it's actually worn out. If you can't find any play, but this boot is all torn out, it's kind of a death sentence for this. Eventually, in the next couple months, 6 months to a year, that inner tie rod is going to fail because this boot is not protecting it. On an inner tie rod, if you're able to take that rubber boot off, this is what it looks like underneath. This side threads onto the end of your power steering rack, and this is the rod that connects to your outer tie rod. Now, in this case, you can see that this goes up and down, left and right, so we can go over bumps and turn, but there is zero play on this part, so when I try to pull it, this metal piece comes with it at the same rate. There's no play this way. So this is actually a good inner joint. Now, after checking our inner tie rod underneath that rubber bellows, if we follow that rubber bellows, it will continue to our next part, which is our power steering rack. Now, this power steering rack can be hydraulically powered, or it can be an electrically driven one, like on new vehicles. And this power steering rack is what's actually getting those inner and outer tie rods to move when we steer the wheel. Now, we don't want to have vibrations transmitted up through our steering rack and into our frame and shaking the car. So wherever this power steering rack bolts to the frame or to a subframe, there's going to be two bolts, and there's going to be some rubber isolation kind of dampening washers that go in, and those can be deteriorated, or these actual bolts could be loose. So this is our next check. Now, you can get someone to turn the wheels hard left and right while you do this check, but it's probably easier if you can get someone turning the wheel back and forth with the steering wheel with the power steering on, so the vehicle is on, and that way you can actually see if this power steering rack is moving independently of the frame. So you just put your fingers in between both and get them to do that, and there should be absolutely zero movement. If there is, then we got some play, and usually it's the bushings that are no good. And you can also very carefully get your pry bar in here if you suspect that, and kind of pry between the subframe and the bracket for the power steering rack, and just give it some light tension on it and see if there's any movement. If there is, it's your power steering rack bushings. Now, the power steering rack bushings on this vehicle are way up at the top and very hard to get at and very hard to film. So rather than try to show you that, I'm going to post you a couple pictures here and show you what they look like on other vehicles, and some examples of some good and bad power steering rack bushings and what to look for. Now, if you've got an older car, you may find that you've got a parallelogram set up. So in that case, you're going to have a center link that attaches to your inner tie rods. And on the end of the center links, you're going to find that you've got a ball and socket joint. That this one is part of your idler arm. And over here by the power steering box, you've got another one here, which is your pitman arm. So these are also going to have to be checked just like the outer tie rods that we just showed. Now, there can be some play issues inside your power steering box, but that's kind of like a whole other video. And if you have a power steering box in your old car or truck, you're going to have a shaft that comes up. And once again, they do not want to have the vibrations and road noise from the steering system coming up into the steering wheel and making some vibrations for the driver. So what they often do is somewhere on the shaft, it connects to another shaft by the use of a rag joint. And it's essentially just like a big, thick, tough piece of rubber that helps kind of grab and isolate those vibrations and help them not transmit it into the steering wheel. So you could have one of these that is blown. So once again, get someone to turn the wheel left and right, look for the clunks, and take a look and see if there's some movement between the two shafts and they're not moving together at the same time. Okay, on most modern cars off the power steering rack, you're going to see some kind of U-joint kind of set up. So find where that U-joint is, and once again, get someone to turn the steering wheel left and right and see if the two halves of that U-joint are moving together or they're kind of moving independently and a little bit lagging behind. Now, what you're looking for these steering shaft U-joints is that both halves of these U-joints move together when you move the wheel back and forth. If they move independently, like this, that's no good. Okay, and as an example from a real life car, this is a steering shaft that has some universal joints so that these joints can be at any angle they need to be able to get around the engine and stuff like that, and to get the steering wheel shaft to connect to the power steering rack. So they can move left and right and up and down, but there should be absolutely no play when you turn it between these two halves. All right, after final inspection of this 2007 Dodge Nitro, there is a little bit of play left and right on the driver's front wheel. And a little bit more inspection, pinching that inner boot, that inner tie rod while somebody was shaking the wheel, I can feel a little bit of play on the inner tie rod. So this vehicle is going to get that replaced, and you can watch that because I'm going to be making a video for you on how to do that. So stay tuned for that. All right, so you've checked all your steering system components and you found one faulty part. But something to make you think about here is, do you change the other outer tie rod because you're in there already? And do you actually change the other side inner and outer tie rod at the same time? Because when we're talking about steering components, when we have to change steering components, you have to go get a wheel alignment after, which is about $150 to $200. So imagine we just changed the one part, spend our money on that alignment, and then in 6 months to a year, we have that outer tie rod fail or the other side now too. So just something to think about so that you can be wise with the way you spend your money and your time. All right, that's a wrap in another video from Way of the Wrench, this time on how to check all your steering components for any kind of play, wear, or issues. If you have any questions or concerns, put them down below in the comment section. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And if I was able to help you out, maybe you could help us out here and go check out our Patreon. I'll put the link down in the video description below. And if you haven't already, why don't you join us on Instagram? That way you can see and check out all the cool stuff that's going on in the shop in between videos. Till next time, take it easy.